Alright, disclaimer, for any of you guys out there who are way too much into these motorized bikes, please know that this is the first one I ever built. I just bought the kit, $100 Walmart bike, $120 Amazon engine kit, followed the instructions, watched a couple of YouTube videos and put it together. So I'm by no means an expert and don't expect this to be a perfectly running machine. This being the first one I built actually is just kind of the learning curve. Once I figure out exactly what I'm doing, I'm gonna buy a cruiser bike and then a second engine and put it on that one, and then probably sell this one if I can get it running perfect. Anyways, the engine seems to be running fine. Best I can tell. I don't know much about these little two-strokes, so you know, if it's not tuned, please forgive me. Have your criticism be constructive at least. I'm gonna go ahead and ride it for you guys, and I don't know, just kind of a fun little thing to get around with on some side dirt roads, I figure. A little smoky at the moment because it's the 16:1 break-in ratio. I really need to get a better kickstand because the little Walmart kickstand ain't cutting it. Alright, so for anybody interested in which engine kit I chose, now these are all over Amazon and they're all over eBay and they're all going to cost between $100 to $130. This particular one on Prime was $126 and I chose this one because it came with the speedometer. I'm actually going to take the speedometer off the bike to make it a little less cluttered and a little more of a sleeper, whereas it looks like a regular pedal bike from about 25 yards. So it doesn't draw too much attention because the legality of these things is iffy. Louisiana state definition of a motorized bicycle and a moped is not very well written and can be interpreted many different ways. And just one example is the fact that this doesn't have a transmission at all. It's direct drive with a dry clutch. And Louisiana has a definition of a motorized bicycle having an automatic transmission. Something like that. I don't fully understand it. So I want the bike to look as regular as possible. And as you can tell from the video, from about 25 yards, the bike looks like a regular old pedal bike, with the only noticeable difference being the small amount of smoke coming out of the muffler and the sound. Simply because I'm in the break-in period, it's got a little more smoke than it normally would. So for the bike I chose, this is Mongoose 700C, and I just picked this off the rack of my local Walmart. This is not the best bike to choose, and I'll show you why in a moment, but it does work, and the installation was fairly simple. It's a cheap bike, don't expect it to last very long. I expect the engine kit to outlast the bike, but it does work, and it's not complete terrible garbage. Now the speedometer it comes with is in kilometers per hour, and here in the United States we use miles per hour, so it can be kind of tricky at first to get used to, but just know if you want to stay under the most legal speed limit possible for a motorized bike or a motor assisted bike, if you're going 30 kilometers an hour, you're pretty much good at 18 miles an hour. You're under the United States federal guidelines for a motorized bicycle, but that differs from state to state. So I just think if I'm going 30, I'm fine, and don't go faster than 30 kilometers an hour. But I probably won't even hit that because honestly, I just have this motor on here so I can putt around and not really go faster than I can pedal. Now, because these are such a compact build, pretty much anybody with a little bit of mechanical ingenuity can make them. And that will lead people to start doing it. But it's important to remember where you're going to store it, okay? It's got the same footprint as a bike. So basically anywhere you store a regular mountain bike, you can store this. But because of that, you got to remember these two-stroke engines, you store it in a room and that room's going to smell a little bit like a two-stroke engine. It's going to smell like a garage or a shed. So I just keep mine in the laundry room because the laundry room has a whole bunch of stuff that keeps it smelling good and it doesn't smell like gas. So if I was put in the room with my other bike, that room would smell like gas. I also forgot to mention that the speedometer on this kit also has an odometer. I think all the speedometers have an odometer. I figured while they're out, I might as well show you a few things on the bike. Why this frame works, why I chose it, but why it's also not the best frame to choose. The original frame I chose was, and I apologize about the lighting, a 29-inch mountain bike that was also made by Mongoose. It had what looked like plenty of room in here, but unfortunately the bottom bar was so thick that I really had a hard time using the universal mount, and by the time I got the engine onto that mountain bike, the engine was so high that there was not enough room for the carburetor, and the only way I could have made it fit is if I drilled a hole through the frame to run the cable through. Now, although that was a viable option, I didn't like the idea of drilling a hole through the main structure of the frame, even if it was just a small hole. I'm sure it would be fine for just street use, but I always have that feeling that it might buckle. So I returned that bike and I purchased this one, which was the only other option that Walmart really had at the time. This is a 700C bike, and I had a tape measure so I could measure the distance from this bar to this corner, which I believe is the critical distance, and according to the specs in the instructions, this bike had enough. And as you can see, it does, but just barely. This bike works, but unfortunately this bottom bar is still a little thicker than I'd like, so I still had to use the universal mount. Ideally, you'd want this bottom bar to be as thick or maybe just a little thicker than this tube right here that your seat goes into, because as you can see, this clamps on just fine with the stock mount, but this has to use the universal mount, which means the engine is raised. If you have to use the universal mount, the engine is raised, which makes it really tight to fit the carburetor. Now, as you can see, this does fit, but man, it is tight. I had to turn the carburetor just a tiny little bit so that this cable could run down. It's not much, and you really can't tell that the carburetor's turned unless you point it out and start looking at it, but it doesn't seem to affect the engine's performance. As best I can tell, it runs just fine when I'm turning, when I'm running straight. So keep that in mind. If your bike has a bigger bottom plate, you're gonna run into some clearance issues, and that might make things tricky. Other than that, this was a straightforward install. Being the first time I did it, it took about 6 hours, I guess. And of course, everybody knows that the biggest pain in the ass was the sprocket, mounting that to the back tire. I had to take that on and off and readjust it so many times to get it to run true, because even if you do everything just as the instructions and internet videos tell you, you run into problems with these cheap bikes. The spokes are really thin, so as you start to tighten this and you think you got it running true, whenever you go and test it again, you'll find out that it's actually shifted and the spokes have bent. So with combination of using the little screwdriver trick, spinning the wheel to make sure it's running true, tightening the right bolts, and a rubber mallet, I finally got this to run true enough. It's not perfect, but the chain stays on, and I'm confident enough to run this miles away from the home. Also, another big pain in the ass was this tensioner pulley, because this particular bike does not have a round. You see how this support tube is round and this one is oval? It's like an egg. That made this a pain in the ass, because when I tightened the tensioner on, it would only go one way. So as you would tighten the tensioner, it would settle in to the position guided by this oval tube, and you really couldn't adjust it in or out. So I had to tighten it down and then basically just whack it with a rubber mallet until I got it pushed in far enough so that it would guide the chain. And I had to actually do that 2 times after running the bike a couple of times, because it would shift. I eventually got it to stay enough, but I'm going to replace this pulley with the gear pulley so that it can guide the chain a little better eventually, but I'll just wait for this one to wear out, I guess. Other than that, I guess that's it. I keep a little tiny piece of tissue and some paper towel tucked into the muffler so I can store this in my pantry without it leaking oil all over the place. 2-cycle engines, especially when you're breaking them in, they'll have a lot of excess oil that'll settle and then drip out of the muffler, and that'll drop on your floor. If you store the bike inside, that's not good. So that. And don't forget to take it out. Otherwise you'll just blow it out when you start the engine. Won't really hurt anything, but yeah. Not the most professional way of doing things, I know, but I mean, what can I say? This is the first real experience I've ever had with working on a 2-stroke engine, you know. That's it. I took a weed eater apart once and I could never put it back together when I was a little kid. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. This is just 3 days of running it. I will say one thing, it's really tempting when you get it running to just want to go. Just go down roads you've never been down and just keep going. I recommend not going any further than you feel comfortable pedaling back, because especially while you're breaking them in, chain's going to come loose, tensioner's going to move, your sprocket's probably going to unbalance itself on these cheap bikes at least, and well, I guess that's it.
Here we go.
It's so beautiful.